Hello all, today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 8. We're looking at the early Middle Ages. So again, a lot of times this is referred to as kind of the Dark Ages, and that's kind of the time period we're looking at. So if you ever heard that phrase used when looking at this particular period of time, it matches up with what we're taking a look at. One of the reasons why we call this kind of the Dark Ages is because it wasn't a very enjoyable place to live. One of the major reasons we see this is simply that the farming methods being used were not able to create enough supply of food. People were literally starving to death, right? Which again, obviously that's not a very enjoyable situation. They just simply didn't understand how to grow things, how to fertilize crops, and all of these different aspects that allow for large farming operations. They simply didn't exist in this period of time. Now, during this time period, we do start to see some major names come about, and these are kind of unifying forces in Europe. And the first we're going to take a look at is Charlemagne. So Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, is a Frankish king who kind of unifies this area. And the Frankish kingdom would be starting out kind of in what we would call France, which is where France comes from, meaning Frankish. But eventually, Charlemagne is able to, again, modern countries, but France, Belgium, the Netherlands, most of Germany, into Austria, all the way down into Spain, northern Italy. So again, this is a huge empire being controlled by this one particular person. And in fact, in 800 AD, he is crowned the Emperor of Rome. So he kind of helps the Pope out of a bit of a pickle the Pope's in. In exchange, the Pope crowns him basically the Roman Empire. So again, there really hasn't been a Rome as we knew it for almost 400 years at this point. So again, kind of this idea of, is this still kind of the Rome that we've studied previously? Is this a completely different new Rome? Is there such a thing as a Roman Empire? Remember, we still have the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire we talked about before. They still exist and they still have their own emperor. Are these two people equals? So again, it actually causes a lot more questions than it does answers when he is crowned the Emperor of Rome. And again, this is going to stretch all the way from kind of that North Sea all the way down to the Mediterranean. So again, major parts of Europe that we would see today. All right, some of the things we see kind of going on during this time period, again, the Christian church is continuing to grow, and we start to see some modern things that we think of maybe when we think of church life, things like monogamy, the idea of not granting divorces, or if a divorce is granted, it's more of a dissolution. So again, kind of modern terminology that we see when it comes to marriage and church life and all of these different things really kind of begin to take form during this time period. But the biggest thing the church pushes for is no contraception. I thought this was kind of interesting looking at the book. Contraception was actually a worse thing in the church's eye than being homosexual, right? So again, we obviously have modern views on homosexuality. It's not necessarily as big of a deal, but again, we're talking thousands of years ago. Oh, that must have been a big deal. It actually wasn't as much of a big deal as simply using contraception. Even in a marriage, using contraceptive techniques was frowned upon. So again, kind of an interesting look at history, not necessarily maybe the ways that we would expect it to be. So kind of an interesting take there. We certainly see medicine being practiced during this time period, obviously very rudimentary. They didn't really understand how the human body works. They certainly didn't understand germs and things of that nature. That's going to lead to some nasty plagues that we'll be looking at in future chapters for sure. So we have this Charlemagne character, again, kind of unifying all of this area of Europe, but eventually he's going to pass away, right? His son is going to take over. The son does a pretty good job of holding things together, but then that son dies, and now it's kind of the grandkids, and the grandkids aren't so great. There's 3 grandkids. They divide the kingdom up. We have Charles the Bald, which I feel like is a terrible nickname. We have Louis the German, and we have Lothar. And again, they're going to take that empire and divide it up between the 3 of them. So again, we kind of have this Roman Empire-esque thing kind of being formed, and then we kind of have it disintegrating. And all these different groups that kind of break off, and a lot of it's based off of language, right? So the kingdom of Charles the Bald, which is kind of predominant France, uses a lot more Latin, and that's where France gets its backing from. The kingdom of Louis the German is going to speak more of that Slavic language, and that's really where German is going to have its base out of, the Germanic languages. So again, that's kind of that dividing line why we see modern-day European countries having such varied languages. We also have some more people kind of entering the European picture. One of the groups we have is a group called the Magyars that kind of come from the steppes of Asia. So kind of that flat area of Russia. They come into Europe. There's some conflict there. They are defeated militarily, but they do settle in the general European theater, and they actually become Hungary, is what we would call it. So the Kingdom of Hungary is kind of founded by this group that is entering Europe during this time period. It's also during this time period that we see the introduction of Vikings. So again, these are people from Scandinavia. Not only do they conquer parts of Europe, they raid, they pillage, they do all those things that we expect from Vikings, but they're also really amazing explorers. And their ships are incredibly, well built and allow them for ocean voyages. And they find places like Iceland and Greenland. And in fact, there's Viking settlements even in North America on the coast of Newfoundland. So again, this is still hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus or any idea that there is a North American continent even in existence. So again, the Vikings are able to do all of this. They're also kind of trading down through the rivers of Europe. They come into contact with Islamic traders and Asian traders. So again, the Vikings, for all of the negative kind of pillaging and burning and all of that stuff, they really unified Europe in a lot of different ways. Via trade, via this idea of people living closer together for mutual protection. And all of that comes about because of the Viking raiding that happens at this time. Now, the majority of people that live in Europe at this particular time are probably a fief. Simply meaning you are a servant. You work for someone, you live on their land, you farm for them. So again, it's not slavery in the sense that they own you, but there's usually some kind of contractual obligation there that makes you have to stay on their particular piece of land. So again, we're into this kind of fiefdom and kind of this manner that we're speaking of, where there's, a noble family that owns a plot of land, that people live there, they pay homage to this person, they work for that person, they might have to serve that person militarily. A certain portion of what they produce has to go to that person. So again, kind of things we maybe think of with that Middle Ages look comes about during this time period for sure. Excuse me. Some other kind of specific things from this time period. The vast majority of people during this time period worked in agriculture, right? They worked the land, they're farmers, whether they own their own small plot, whether they, work as a serf on a noble person's land. Again, about 90% of people in Europe work in some kind of agricultural fashion during this particular time period. Kind of looking back at the Byzantine Empire, again, this is the eastern part of the Roman Empire that's broken off. Again, we're 400, 500, 600 years after kind of that fall of Rome as we looked at it. But again, this empire is still growing and shrinking. Again, they're coming into contact with Slavic people. They're coming into contact with an emerging Islamic people. And again, the Byzantine Empire kind of ebbs and flows. They're mostly on the ebb by this point in time, right? The Byzantine Empire is shrinking. They obviously have Constantinople as their base. They control parts of Asia Minor, some of southeastern Europe, the Slavic regions as we refer to them today, around the Balkans. But again, this empire is getting much, much smaller. And we mentioned part of that reason is they're coming into contact with growing Islamic power. And one of those groups we see is the Abbasid dynasty, which again kind of grows and spreads Islam. We see it going throughout, obviously, the Arabian Peninsula into what used to be parts of Persia, into North Africa. We're now going to see the invasion of Spain and Portugal. So again, Islam is spreading during this time period as well. I mentioned these Slavic people, and there are different ways to kind of look at them. The book kind of divides it up in Western, Southern, and Eastern Slavic people. Western Slavic people would be places, again, modern-day countries, places like Czechoslovakia, Austria, kind of that region of the particular world, kind of going down into Hungary. Southern Slavs obviously would go a little bit farther down then into the Balkan regions, Croatians, Serbs. Even so today, we have conflicts with these particular groups that don't necessarily like each other all that much. And again, it traces their roots thousands of years ago to what we are looking at this period of time. A couple other key points that we see is one of the reasons why Islamic culture is so important at this period of time. Obviously, it's spreading a faith and all of that's great, but the one thing that kind of benefits society going forward in many ways is that they're preserving education. They're preserving this idea of, past societies and what they had to say, and specifically Greek. Most people in Europe didn't really know much about Greek culture. Nobody studied Greek philosophers. The only group that was really paying attention to them were Islamic Islamic scholars, right? And they started all these groups. For example, in Baghdad, they had the House of Wisdom. And it was a place where ancient manuscripts, whether they were written in Latin, whether they're written in Greek, whatever, would be then translated into Arabic. And eventually those Arabic translations get translated back into European languages. And that's how a lot of Europe ends up learning about ancient Greece and all these different ideas. And again, the Islamic communities are far advanced when it comes to medicine, when it comes to things like mathematics. Algebra is invented during this time. The use of the zero, which sounds kind of strange, like zero, it's zero, that doesn't exist in Europe at this point in time. So again, a lot of this knowledge is being preserved by these Islamic countries, which again is going to greatly benefit all of civilization as we move forward. So again, that is our look at Chapter 8. Make sure you take the quiz and make your post for the week. Have a good day.